My story takes place back in the 1980s when I was just a young girl growing up in Story County, Iowa. Back in those days, I spent a lot of time at my grandparents' farm. Grandma and Grandpa had a lot of farm animals for many years, but in the late 1970s and early 80s, they sold their horses, the remaining cattle they had, and the pigs that they kept in the pen. Although they sold almost all the livestock they had, they kept their chickens in a large wooden wire coop that was situated and built onto the side of a wooden tool shed. Grandma or Grandpa would usually be the ones to grab a basket and collect the eggs, but when I was around, they'd let me do it. It felt good to contribute in some fashion. Not that my grandparents needed much help. They were spry and tough and hardworking, and they weren't afraid of physical labor. 300 feet or so behind the house was a big barn, and at one time it was where the horses and the cattle were kept. In the very back and off to the side, there was an enclosed pig pen and trough. It stunk to high heaven with all the pig poop when they were there, but in the early 80s, that was all a memory. Not long after all the animals had been sold off, aside from the chickens, I went to my grandparents' house after school, and when I got there, they said they wanted to speak to me. Well, at first, I was worried I had done something wrong, but they assured me it wasn't anything like that. Grandma was smiling the whole time, and Grandpa did the talking. Becky, you might see one of them one day, and I want to tell you about them now so you won't be alarmed. He told me that for the past 2 weeks or so, a large hairy man and a hairy woman had been staying in the barn. He said that early one morning he was outside checking on the chickens in the coop. He saw the barn door was open, so he went in to check it out. And when he reached the barn entrance, he saw a tall, hairy man standing there and a tall, hairy woman standing next to him. He felt they didn't mean him any harm, and he could see the intelligence in their eyes and felt that if he spoke to them, they would understand him. He told them they could stay in the barn, but that he had 3 rules. Rule 1 was, don't come close to my family. I don't want them to be scared. Rule 2 was, don't eat my chickens. And Rule 3, don't damage my property. And if you're inside the barn, close the door behind you. Both of them exhaled softly, and Grandpa took it as a pair understanding and agreeing to his conditions. From what he had seen of these hairy folks, they almost always left in the wee hours. They went to the woods all day and came back under cover of night. He told me from now on I was only allowed to go as far as the chicken coop, but that we could work out a time for me to see them from the kitchen window with the binoculars. Grandpa told me not to say a word of this to my parents, or my aunt and my uncle, and the kids at school. He said, don't tell anyone. I wasn't ever a snitch, and I wouldn't think of betraying the trust that my grandma and grandpa placed in me, so I agreed. It was hard keeping my mouth shut, though, with what I knew. I still never spilled the beans, and I didn't tell a soul. It wasn't long after that when my grandparents let me spend Friday night at their house. I remember Grandma waking me up early Saturday morning, telling me to quickly dress and come to the kitchen. When I made my way down there, I saw Grandpa already waiting. He had the binoculars ready and had me looking out the large window, focusing my attention on the barn doors. Well, I kept watching for a minute or two, and finally the barn doors opened up slowly, and I saw 2 huge hairy people walk out, first the male and then the female right behind. I remember being so shocked seeing them both. I remember their fur being a dirty brown and hanging off their bodies. The male was a few inches taller than the female, and while she was smaller than he was, she was by no means short. As quickly as they appeared, they moved around the side of the barn and they were out of sight. They looked like Chewbacca, but much bigger. I wasn't scared, though that might not have been the case if I had seen them up close and personal like he had. That was the one and only time I saw them. According to Grandpa, they stayed just a couple of more months and then they left and they never returned. He said that one time he heard a few coyotes barking not far from the house when a deafening roar was unleashed. promptly shutting the canines up and scattering them. Sadly, I lost my grandparents years ago, but I will never forget the special times I spent with them and the time that I saw those two hairy giant people whom I think just needed a temporary place to call home for a bit. Thank you for reading my story and taking the time to share it with your audience. And the woman signs off. That's a really good story. I cannot imagine having that kind of memory. I don't think that memory would ever leave me till the day I die. And she had such good restraint, not telling her friends and her parents and other people. Keeping that secret must have been brutal on her. It must have been just repressive, because I would want to tell everybody what I had seen. But this was a great story. Thank you so much for sending it, ma'am. Hey y'all, welcome back to the Dixie Cryptid channel. I've been gone a while. I don't know how to explain it. I've had a lot of work with my regular job, and sometimes I just want to be quiet and relax a little. So I took about a month and a half, did a few shorts, a couple of podcasts, but that's all I did. But I'm feeling it now and I'm back. This podcast has 6 stories from viewers. And at the end, there's a little fictional short story that I wrote. It's not a monster story. I was just sitting here one day and I just thought about a couple of things that could happen. I want to say it was Christmas Eve, maybe. It didn't have anything to do, and I just wrote a story. It's not very good, but I hope you enjoy it. You deserve a long video, and I'll keep cranking them out as usual, starting with this one. All right, here we go.
The darkness nearly drowned me.
I grew up on a farm in Martinsville, Indiana. My first encounter was when I was about 7 years old. I had an ice-sized pond that my dad had built by damming up a holler on the far side of the property. It was overgrown with vegetation, and only a couple of small trees were cleared for our favorite fishing spots. I loved to go deep into the brush to get my own little honey hole where I'd catch giant bluegill all day long. One day, my best friend was staying over for a sleepover. And after school, we grabbed our fishing gear and headed to my honey hole. We fished till dusk, and when we started to pack up our gear, my friend Josh asked, "Did you hear that?" "What?" I asked. "A growl. I heard a growl," he said. We looked around and waited for a minute. We heard a twig snap, and then we grabbed our gear and hightailed it across the field back to my house. Being kids, our imaginations ran wild, thinking of the Goosebumps stories we used to read. 5 years later, I got into hunting. My dad had passed away when I was 5, so I was pretty much on my own and learning how to hunt. But I had a cousin who lived just down the road. He had a couple of 100 acres of land that had some of the best deer hunting in the county. There were many times I'd be out in those woods and I'd hear strange things like whoops and tree knocks. But there was always someone else hunting the property during deer season, so I just brushed it off as them communicating to each other somehow. Bigfoot never crossed my mind. In 2007, my best friend Tyler and I were hunting in the same area one morning. We decided to skip school because all the other hunters would be at work. So we had the whole place to ourselves. Well, we split up, and I took the stand at the far east end of the property, and he took the far west end. Around noon, we had planned to meet at the drive that ran up the middle of the property. I got there a little early, so I waited on him. I saw him working his way toward me, and several times I saw him raise his 12 gauge and pointed at something toward the tree line. And when he finally got to me, I asked him what he was pointing his gun at. "Did you not hear that clapping?" he asked me. "No," I said with a shrug. He said someone was clapping 20 yards away into the trees, keeping pace with him. They were walking in the tree line and he couldn't see them. They did it 3 times, and it was making him nervous because no one should have been there. Well, I shrugged that off and we started heading back to the truck. And when we got about 50 yards from the truck, we heard the clapping and then a loud grunt. I figured maybe someone from the neighboring properties was just screwing with us, but it was still strange. A week later, we decided to go coyote hunting, and Tyler's cousin came along for the hunt. We went to my cousin's property because we had a bad problem with coyotes. They were killing new fawns in the spring, and he was happy to let us do some pest control. That night, we got into the field and got all set up with our call, and we waited. And 15 minutes in, though, the wind kicked up, and it ruined our chances for a good hunt. And we started packing up when Tyler's cousin got scared. "What the hell?" he whispered, looking up toward the sky. Well, we looked up too, and we saw a bright white light. At first, we figured it was a low-flying plane, but we quickly realized that it was not. It was just sitting motionless in the sky, and then in a split second, it vanished. We looked at each other dumbfounded and agreed it was time to go. As if that wasn't enough excitement for one night, when we got into the truck, we saw 4 pair of red eyes looking right at us from the tree line. They were 8 feet off the ground. We never went coyote hunting again there in the dark. In 2017, I had moved away to Bozeman, Montana, and I was on my first solo elk hunt up in Little Bear Canyon on Wheeler Mountain. I had gotten to the trailhead at 4 a.m. and got all my gear ready to start my hike. The whole time I had an unsettling feeling that I was being watched and that something was wrong. My gut kept telling me, "Don't leave the truck yet." I got in my truck and waited. I'd never been afraid of being in the woods when it was dark out, but something just kept telling me something bad was about to happen if I had started my hike up the mountain. Once it got a little bit light out, the feeling went away and I started my hike. I could see elk 1,000 yards away across a draw, so I climbed higher up to stay downwind from them. I came to a clearing that was surrounded by trees, and I was getting ready to enter the other side of the woods, and I heard a loud crash of trees falling. It was so loud it made me jump backward and draw my sidearm. I went over every possibility in my mind of what it could be, but what followed was complete silence. There was no moose charging me, no birds chirping, nothing. I waited for 5 minutes, just frozen, and then I looked over and I saw the elk were starting to move. I tried again to enter the woods to get ahead of them when a branch about the size of my arm came flying through the air right in front of me. I decided someone or something had given me fair warning not to try to come into those woods again, so I turned around and I headed back to my truck. The day wasn't a total loss, though. I bagged a nice mule deer on the way back. This was the encounter that made me start to really look into the possibility of Bigfoot. In 2018, I was taking a load of hay down to Idaho, following the Madison River south of Enos, Montana. It was around 10 a.m. on a clear sunny morning, and I was coming to a bend in the road that looked out over an open field. And standing right next to the river stood the biggest, blackest, hairiest thing I had ever seen. It stood up on 2 legs. Its hands hung down below its waist, and it was looking right at me. And then it turned and ran back to the forest with a speed that I had never seen or could believe was possible. Then and there, I knew exactly what I was looking at. It was my first sighting of Bigfoot. I've had many more small encounters that I could talk about all day, but I'm writing all this on my phone, so my thumbs are tired. Thanks for reading my story. Oh man, you're welcome. That was a good story. That was a good series of stories. To have all these encounters and little incidents happen that kind of made you wonder, and then to finally confirm that the creature is real with a full visual sighting. Awesome story. I really appreciate it. My name is Ron, and I live in rural northern Kentucky. My county has a population of about 15,000 souls, including my small town of about 2,000. I live on 23 acres right on the river. My land is bordered by several miles of heavily wooded river frontage upstream and scattered pasture land and woods downstream. Sometime in the late 90s, I had a dog named Jumper. He was a natural squirrel hunter born with the instinct to chase critters up trees and bark loudly at them. One summer afternoon, I was walking in the woods with Jumper ahead of me, sniffing and sighting. I heard her familiar report, and I figured she had treed a squirrel, a groundhog, or a raccoon, as was common for her. I walked up on her, and I saw a large cat on a branch just out of her reach. It was staring straight at her, and its tail slowly waving back and forth. Judging by the size of its head and neck, it was a tomcat. It was healthy and muscular and solid black with large yellow eyes. It sort of looked like a feral house cat, but it was big as a bobcat, and I had never seen anything like this. As soon as it saw me, it ran over the top of Jumper's back, and the chase was on. I heard them running quickly through the underbrush, and within seconds, they were gone. A few minutes later, Jumper came back, the cat apparently having escaped. She seemed proud of herself anyway, while I was thinking she was lucky that thing didn't catch her. Not long after that, I was fishing in the river at the downstream end of my property. My two friends were at my house doing some drywall work for me. I knew they would finish and be heading home soon, so I packed up my gear and I headed back up the hill toward the house. My friend Dave met me in a small field overlooking the river, and we stopped for a few minutes to talk. All at once, a loud and long howling, growling kind of call echoed through the valley. Dave and I looked at each other, and both of us were confused. Neither of us had ever heard such a thing. It sounded to be coming from across the river, and it was loud as a train wreck. I told myself that it must have been that giant black cat I had seen getting into an awful fight with another of its kind. I knew that wasn't true. There was no way even the biggest cat could have made such a commotion, but I had to tell myself something. A week later, Dave called me. He had seen a news story that played a recording of a supposed Sasquatch scream. Dave pointed out that it was just like the sound we heard, and I believe I could walk up that river corridor all the way across the state without being seen if I did not want to. So I think it's possible a creature, perhaps with better hearing and senses than mine, could easily do the same. Now, I don't really know what it was, but I'm telling myself it was the damn cat. I know that's not true, but I have to tell myself something. In August of 1981, I went camping and hiking along part of the John Muir Trail at Mount Whitney with a small band of my neighborhood friends and their parents. We weren't your normal kids. We read field tactical manuals instead of comic books. We were obsessed with the Vietnam War and the parts of the Cold War that we were exposed to. We used to challenge kids from other neighborhoods to BB gun fights at night at a park that was suited to this type of activity. My friends Pat, Joe, and John and I packed into a Volkswagen van with Pat's parents and his little sister. We drove north until we got to the 395 and passed the military aircraft boneyard. There they have all kinds of different planes sitting out in the Mojave Desert sun where they won't rust and can't be used for spare parts. We drove through Lone Pine and then made the trek up a winding road to the Mount Whitney campground parking lot. Once we got out and got our packs ready, we had lunch and started out on our hike. Our backpacks weren't just filled with clothes and food and sleeping bags. We hid our BB guns and camouflage fatigues in there too. It was our mission to play war while we were out there. We hiked for what seemed like hours. The trail was worn, and the chirps and screeches from the local wildlife made their presence known all around us. We didn't see anything, though, with the exception of a few birds and squirrels. But despite that, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Out of the four of us guys, I was the only one who had a fascination with Bigfoot. It had started in the 4th grade with some books in the library. There were short stories about Mighty Momo and the Fouke Monster. I had also seen The Legend of Boggy Creek and episodes of In Search of with Leonard Nimoy. Those had fanned the flames of my interest. During the hike, I came to the logical conclusion that my feeling of being watched was on account of all the stuff I had read and watched on the topic of Bigfoot. Thinking about it spooked me, and I never mentioned it to my friends for fear of being ridiculed. The end of our hike came when we reached the flat meadow surrounded by trees. There was still some snow on the ground that looked like it was permanently frozen, and the clearing was next to a salmon hatchery, complete with a fish and game sign that prohibited us from fishing there. Fishing wasn't on our agenda, and my friend's dad decided that it was a good place to camp for the night. We took off our packs and helped set up the 3 tents. We helped dig a campfire pit a little deeper and dump the ashes from other campers in the trash can left there by fish and game. Late afternoon was starting to creep up on us, and a strong wind began to blow. It was already a little chilly, too chilly for a summer hike, but the leftover snow over by the creek was telling me different. Some of the adults started in on dinner, which was an amazing thought. I was starving, and my buddies and I got inside of our tent and arranged with our sleeping bags. I positioned myself just inside the flap so I could poke an eye out if I heard anything, because I was starting to get the feeling that we were being watched again. We still had some time before dinner was ready, so we decided to take a quick look around while there was still some light out. We walked along the creek so we couldn't get lost, and somewhere around 100 yards away from the campsite, I found what looked like an old track. It was huge. It was too big to be a man's track. The mud was dried and it was cracked where the toes would have been. Well, I shrugged it off as a coincidence, and we heard an air horn that my friend's dad used for emergencies, and we figured that dinner was ready. We ran back and settled into plates full of hot dogs and chili beans. I was in heaven. And after dinner, we helped clean up. I was charged with taking the trash to the can left by the Fish and Game Commission. I made my way down the path with a flashlight so I could stay on the path. I found the can and put our traces of civilized life inside, and when I closed it, I realized how quiet it was. There was no noise whatsoever except what noise the wind was making as it passed through the trees and rattled the leaves. Again, I got that distinct feeling that I was being watched. I looked around with a flashlight, but when I didn't see anything, I walked the short trip back to camp. My friend's dad had a nice campfire going, and we took fold-out chairs and surrounded it. This man told us stories about being a customs agent and some of the unclassified details of things going on in Miami. We were riveted by the stories of shootouts and bad guys who tried to get away. At some point during the storytelling, my friend's dad paused and looked into the forest for a moment. Since I was the only one on his side of the campfire, I looked where he was looking, and through the mist, I could see eye shine. They looked like they were pretty up there in height. My friend's dad and I exchanged a knowing look, and he continued with his Miami Vice stories. The whole thing took about 5 seconds, but we both knew we saw something. The wind picked up later, and things started blowing around the camp, and we worked together to secure everything, and then we went to bed. The winds were strong, and the gusts were hitting our tent with a good amount of force. At some point during this windstorm, I heard running footsteps coming toward our tent. All of a sudden, the tent spikes on my side of the tent were pulled out, and the tent came up, rolling us up like a burrito. We screamed like little boys do and managed to crawl out of the front door flap. My friend's dad was at the ready, pistol and flashlight in hand, looking around in a circle. We stood around looking for what in the world could have caused that to happen, and then got the tent set up again and reinforced the tent spikes. The following summer, I took a road trip with my dad to visit an old workmate who had retired. Carmen had built a home in the mountains of I can't pronounce this, Nutrioso, Arizona. We had to take a paved road from the main highway and then turn onto a dirt road and trudge our way up the mountain for almost an hour. Well, the drive was worth it, though, because the place was beautiful and it was surrounded by thick, majestic trees. Now, Carmen had a small group of mountain dogs that were all mean and they didn't seem to like anybody. He introduced us to them one at a time until the dogs were all settled down from having strangers on the property. Now, it had been raining for most of this trip. It had only stopped when we got to the paved road off the highway. I figured that I'd be bored listening to my dad and his friend trade old work stories, but Carmen addressed me and asked me to follow him. We went to the back porch and he picked up an old plastic bucket. He told me that after the rain you could find pieces of ancient Native American pottery on the ground. He looked at the ground and pointed one out to me. I brought it back and he showed me what made it different from any of the actual rocks I might have found. I scampered off the porch and started my hunt for more Native American pottery. After a while, I noticed that it had become unnaturally quiet, and I got the feeling that something was watching me again, but this time I could tell where it was from. It was my 10 o'clock. At that exact moment, Carmen's dogs came up and formed a line in front of me. They were looking in the same direction, and they were growling. My mother didn't raise a fool, so I slowly backed out of the area and I ran back to the house. I sat on the porch and I started going through my collection of pottery pieces, and the dogs came up and took up positions around me, lying down and scanning their ears as dogs do. Later, during dinner, I told my dad and Carmen what happened. My dad shrugged it off, but Carmen took me seriously. "You saw El Vejejo," he said. My dad looked at him puzzled, and Carmen said something to him in Spanish about the old man of the mountain. I think he was trying to keep me from getting scared, but I understood most of what he said. My dad and I left a couple of days later. I saw a Native American roadside museum off the highway and asked my dad to stop. He asked why, and I told him that I didn't feel right leaving with all the Native American history in this bucket. Well, he smiled. And I hopped out of the truck and jumped in the shop and I explained what I had, and they thanked me for respecting their spirits. And before I left, I asked them about the old man of the mountain. Well, they looked at each other like they knew something I didn't, and they asked me if I had seen him. "No," I said, and then they relaxed, but one of them raised his eyebrows. "It's a good thing you didn't see him," he said. Oh, that's a cool story. This person, like some of the other people in this podcast, have had various encounters with these creatures, whether they see them or not. But this was really good. It was a good, very detailed story. I appreciate this one. In the fall of 1974, I was a 13-year-old freshman in a small town in South Georgia. I was a military brat. Our family had moved back to Georgia after my daddy retired. My grandfather had passed away in late October, and my mother felt the need to move back home to help look after Grandma. This was our first real home. Everything else had been an apartment or a rental until Uncle Sam was finished with my daddy's enlistment. It was a 2-story house that had been moved into town years before from a large farm out in the country. The porches had fallen victim to the move, as well as the kitchen and the larger dining area that were only attached to the original house by a long porch. The upstairs bedrooms were added after the house was moved. In the bedroom where my brother slept was a closet, and I hated that closet. It gave me an anxious feeling in the pit of my stomach, and it was small, and there was a square cut in the back wall that gave access to the attic. If I were to pass by the closet and the door was open, I made sure to run and slam the door shut before I would go into my room. And at bedtime, after turning off the light, we would run and jump under our covers so the boogers under the bed wouldn't get us. Why we ever thought our covers would protect us, I don't know, but that was the idea. In the fall in South Georgia, football is king, and homecoming fell on the last home game of the season. In those days, it was a custom to build floats for the homecoming parade the week before. As a cheerleader, I was helping with the class and cheerleading float, so I was a busy girl. And on one particular night that week, I had an 8 o'clock curfew. After all, it was a school night. My friend dropped me off, and I went in and started heating up a pot of chili that Mama had left on the stove for us. Nobody else was home, so I got my bowl of chili and crackers and I settled in front of the TV to eat. I think it was about 15 minutes after I settled in that I heard a noise from upstairs. I thought it was my sister, so I called out her name, but there was no response. I called up to her that I was onto her game and she wasn't going to scare me. I still got no response, so I kept eating and watching TV. And then I heard footsteps. There were heavy footsteps going from our bedroom, which was directly over the den, into my brother's room. I leaned forward from my seated position in the floor of the den just enough to see to the top of the stairs. No one was there, but the closet door, the only door upstairs, slammed shut and opened, and then it shut again. "You're not scaring me," I called out to my sister. There was still no response, and I finished eating and took my dishes to the kitchen sink, and I sat back down in the den to finish the show I was watching. 15 minutes later, I heard our back door opening, and my daddy and my younger brother came in. They'd been to my grandmother's house for supper and were just arriving back home. Just a minute after that, Mama and my sister came in the front door. Wait a minute, I thought, looking over at my sister. "Are you just now getting home?" I asked her. She gave me a strange look reserved only for older sisters to look down on their younger siblings who have just asked a totally stupid question. "Yes," she said. "Mama just picked me up from the barn. The Beta Club is building our float there." I jumped up like a frightened cat, and I went to the furthest spot from the foot of the stairs. "What's wrong with you?" my daddy asked. "There's somebody in the house," I yelled. My father took out his gun that he kept with him while he was working and checking his traps, and he told Mama to stay with us. He went up the stairs with his gun at the ready and then came back a few minutes later and gave me a stern look. There was nothing to be found. There was no sign of a break-in. By this point, I was crying, and I promised him I was telling the truth, and my story never changed. I know what I heard. And to this day, I know in my gut it was the booger that was in the back of the closet. In the spring of 1975, I was a freshman in high school. During that winter, a Youth for Christ sharing group had begun meeting on Tuesday nights to share our testimonies and meet with the like-minded high school students from the surrounding counties. For the past 2 weeks, I had been burdened with a gut feeling that I needed to pray for my father. At 42, he was in excellent health. I don't know why I felt this burden, but there it was. I requested for a second week in a row that the group keep him in their prayers. I didn't have a specific prayer, just please pray. When I was dropped off at home that night, I tripped over a game that had been left on the stairs. "You okay, baby?" my daddy called from the bedroom. "Yes, sir," I said. Then I froze in my journey up the stairs. "Go tell him you've been burdened with the prayer for him," my gut urged me. "Go tell him that you love him." I stood there while I argued with myself and decided not to disturb him anymore. I would tell him tomorrow. But tomorrow came and went, and I never told him. And then over the next week, my sister and I had the urge to clean up the house. I kept having the urge to tell my daddy I needed to pray for him, but I never said a word. Sadly, that week he died in an accident. The night he died, we were offered something to help us go to sleep, but I didn't want any. Much later, when the house was quiet and everyone had left, I had to go downstairs to go to the bathroom. Near the bottom step, I noticed a light that had been left on, and I looked up to see who it was. And seated in the rocking chair he'd sat in earlier that afternoon was my daddy. My brain was clear. I knew my daddy had died that afternoon. I was having trouble merging these thoughts, so I plopped down on the step in shock. "I know, baby, but it is me," my daddy said. "He let me come to talk to you to let you know everything's going to be okay, and you're going to be fine, but there will be some bumps in the road. Now be patient. I want you to remember to follow your dreams, never take no for an answer, and keep trying." After a few other messages for my brother and my sisters, he looked at me and he told me he loved me and would always be looking over us, and then he faded away. I went back to bed that night, telling myself that it had been a dream. And the next morning, my oldest sister asked me who had come to the house so late the night before. She said that she'd heard me talking to a man and couldn't imagine who would have come at that hour. I guess I wasn't dreaming after all. In 1983, I found myself living back in my small hometown after finishing college and securing a teaching position at our middle school. I'd gotten engaged in the fall to my fiancée, and we moved in together into my family home. We had added 2 Rottweilers to our family, and we allowed them inside while we were home. After a nice Thanksgiving at our house with my siblings and their spouses and my mother and her new husband, my fiancé and I were in the den relaxing with our Rottweilers from the long week. The dogs were lying near the foot of the stairs playing with their treats when each of them stood up facing the stairway with the hair on their backs raised. Low growls started in their throats, and the younger of the 2 yelped and ran across the room and jumped into my lap. 100-pound Rottweiler is a hefty load, but you've never seen a bigger baby. The older one, Attila, remained at the foot of the stairs, growling and barking and taking a small step backward and forward, preparing to defend himself or flee. My fiancé approached him cautiously. "What's wrong, boy?" he asked. Attila felt a little braver with my fiancé there and kept growling, more confident now. They went up the stairs together, and I could hear the 2 of them exploring the rooms. They came back down, and just as my fiancé had gotten it out of his mouth that they had found nothing, the closet door slammed shut, and we both jumped. Both dogs headed for the back door, and we headed to the truck and went for a short ride to get our nerves settled. 2 weeks later, I had duties as a cheerleading sponsor to attend to at an out-of-town basketball game. I was in a great mood when I arrived back home, and I bounced through the back door and called out to my fiancé and friends whose cars were parked in the driveway, but I got no response. I passed through the kitchen and dining room and stepped into the living room and found my front door wide open. All the lights were on and a Christmas tree half decorated standing in the front window. I checked out all the rooms to be sure they weren't hiding from me, and I sat down to give them a call. My fiancé answered and told me he was over at our friend's house and that I should come over. And late as it was, I closed the doors and turned out the lights. I loaded up my car and went over. This didn't explain their cars in the driveway, but I figured I'd find out. When I arrived, I found them all seated in the living room looking pale and shocked. "What's going on?" I asked the group. "Your house is haunted," my friend Val said. "Well, it dang sure is. Y'all gotta move," my friend Kevin piped in. "It was just like that night after Thanksgiving," my fiancé said. They went on to relate that they were having a good time decorating the tree. The dogs were lying in the dining area watching the activity and chewing on their new bones. They were drinking and enjoying themselves until they heard footsteps in the upstairs bedroom. Looking around the room, taking a head count, everybody was in the den. They thought somebody might have come in when they went to get replacement bulbs and more beer, so Kevin, being the one with a weapon in his car, retrieved it and slowly went up the stairs with the dog behind him. Then the door slammed and the dog and Kevin came tearing down the stairs and raced out the front door. Everyone piled into Val's SUV and left my house. All the doors were wide open and the lights were on, and the dogs were cowering in the back of the vehicle. If they hadn't been so dead serious, and if Kevin wasn't on the verge of tears, I probably would have laughed it off. We were all a bit shaken, and we decided to stay the night with the gang at Robbie and Val's place. We went home the next morning with no problems, and were soon joined by our friends, and we finished decorating the tree. Later that morning, I braved the upstairs to take the empty boxes to be put away, but I didn't open that closet. I placed the boxes in front of the door for my own peace of mind. Our next trip to Savannah, Val and I made a point of going to River Street to visit a shop that deals with unusual items. I purchased sage, holy water, and an abalone shell. the items the vendor told me that were necessary to cleanse the house. The vendor was gracious enough to make a copy of a prayer that I would need during the cleansing. I asked hundreds of questions, it seemed, making sure I wasn't conjuring any bad juju into my home. We were both born-again Christians and each had enough Cherokee blood in our lineage to know that there were things beyond our understanding. That afternoon, the boys and dogs went somewhere, anywhere away from the house. We opened up the windows and began upstairs, closing the windows and sealing them with the holy water in the shape of a cross on the pane. And we spent the most time on the closet with holy water and sage, and sealed the back passage and the door and made our way downstairs, reciting the prayer that we had learned. We covered the bottom floor and ended the prayer with a plea that those present who meant harm are forever expelled from these walls. And as I was putting away the cleansing materials, I opened the closet door in the spare bedroom, the room my parents had used many years before. I caught the smell of my daddy's Old Spice as I put the supplies away. "You're welcome to stay and look over us," I whispered to him as I closed the door. I have been reluctant to share any of these stories. Small towns being what they are, everybody would think I was a few bricks short of a load, and retaining my position as an educator would be difficult. My maternal grandmother told me my gut feelings and knowings are a gift from our Native American blood, and it was not a gift that everyone in our family had been given. As these knowings and gut feelings continue, I'm sure to follow them. I may not always know the why, but I have learned to listen just the same. And then she ends the letter. Sorry, excuse me. She ends her email, "Looking forward to more Steve Lilly." It's so funny to come off a serious email like that and go, "Hey, more Steve Lilly." By the way, I am working on the next Steve Lilly, so stand by on that. But this was a very descriptive and well thought out email from a person who's been through a lot, seen a lot of supernatural and experienced a lot of supernatural things. And I appreciate her taking the time to write these down for us to enjoy, because I did enjoy reading this story. Thank you very much. The White Gown by Cameron Buckner. When I turned the key, I didn't think anything would happen, but it did, and the old tractor started. I connected the battery charger the night before, not knowing if the cell was any good, but I was hopeful. Smoke rolled out from under the shed, water in the lines and mixed with the diesel, and it burned off. I knew I could fix that with fresh diesel, but I just let it smoke. I backed it out and connected the bush hog, and I greased some bearings and wiped the trash off the floor plate that had built up over 3 years. The engine sounded fine. I needed to change the oil, but at the moment, I needed more to get outside and breathe in my freedom. The old machine would make it just fine on 3-year-old oil for an afternoon while I cleared my head. I started cutting the field behind the house. I'd have to take my time. The equipment was old and the field had grown up with saplings every 5 or 10 feet, but not too much that my father's old equipment couldn't handle it. If it'd gone another year, I would have had to have rented something bigger. Field roads flanked the side of the field I was cutting. The roads defined the field. On the right were thick trees, and on the left was the property that belonged to someone else. I'd spend the next day slowly working that piece of land into a field again. I had nothing else to do. At the end of this field was a stand of hardwood timber that had grown taller since I'd been gone. I loved that place in the summer. Mom and Daddy would take us kids down in there and let us swim and play in the cool stream that flowed all the time. Mama would pack leftovers or sandwiches, and her and Daddy would sit in lawn chairs smoking and talking while we ran wild. I should have turned around and made another pass on the field where I started, but whispers of nostalgia greeted me at that old road that cut through there, and I went on down into the woods. Wouldn't hurt to look at the field behind the timber anyway. I would know what I was up against while I got this place back in shape. Water still ran in the creek, and I looked forward to the summer and a place to cool off. Maybe take my sister's kids back in there. I stopped and walked a ways into the woods following the water, and I looked around at the big oaks and hickories, and then I walked back to proceed to the next field, just to take a look. It looked the same as the front field, and I cut one strip right down the middle of it all the way back to our property line, and I turned to go back. It was cloudy that day, one of those days you'd be sure it would rain, but it never did. The dust hovered above me and all the way to the ground, but even still I could see it moving on my neighbor's property. It was something white, snow white, moving in a fluid motion, but it was slow and contrasting with the dull, dusty greens of a hot September day. And when it stopped, it went to the ground, and I got off the tractor to get a better look. I was afraid to cut the engine because I wasn't sure it would start again. After climbing the fence and wading through the brambles, I got to the white object, and there lay a woman who had to be over 80, dressed in a dirty white gown and nothing else. She was on her knees and rubbing the cuts and scratches on her legs and arms. "Ma'am, do you need some help?" She rubbed her arms and tears rolled down her face, and I moved closer. "Let me help you up." From behind her, I slid my arms under hers and tried to lift her slender frame to her feet. She felt like dead weight, like a rag doll. I could have lifted her up, but I wasn't sure how she would react, so I eased her back down into the dry weeds. She had not said anything to this point, and it wasn't plain she knew I was even there. "Who are you?" she asked me. The tractor was running a short piece away, and I had trouble hearing what she said. Her voice was as delicate as I had ever heard. "I'm Jet Travers, ma'am. Who are you, and why are you out here?" "I need to get over there to see him. I have to tell him something." Her hands rose to her face. Her long fingers moved down her cheeks. I didn't know what she was talking about, and I knew for sure that she wasn't getting up. "We need to get you out of this field, ma'am. Can you stand up?" She placed her hands in mine, trying to stand, but she was done. I knew I could carry her, but getting her through the briars I had come through would be painful. "Sit tight, I'll be right back." I used pliers to cut the barbed wire and then drove the tractor to her. It wasn't too far. The noise and the heat coming from the machine bothered her, but that was better than pushing her through more brush. She felt as light as a feather, and her arms naturally slid around my neck, and she lay her head over my shoulder. I need to talk to him," she said. Her eyes were closed when I climbed back on the tractor, and it was awkward with her in my lap, but we made it back to the house. I put her on my couch, and I turned up the air so she could cool off. The last call I wanted to make was to the sheriff's office, but I didn't know what else to do. I had just finished 3 years of a 5-year sentence at Parchman for whipping the shit out of a cop. There was a girl in town I had grown up with. I always liked her, but I never had the nerve to ask her out. Well, I was 6 months out of the Marine Corps and had a decent job at the plant. She worked there too, and I saw her on my way to the break room one day. We talked, and later that week we went out. There's nothing to do in these small towns but to go to Sonic or ride to gravel roads and have a few drinks, and that's what we were doing on that warm June Saturday night. We parked at the watershed where folks had been launching boats and made a natural parking lot. And we talked and watched the stars, and we had a few beers, and that's when the law pulled in behind me. Apparently, the deputy had been going out with this girl and started giving us a hard time. If he had just done his job, I would have accepted my fate and spent the night in jail for open containers, but he couldn't do that. He was a jealous one, and he went to work on me with one of those sticks they use, until I snatched it out of his hands and put that to an end. He was breathing when she and I left the lake, and I figured he'd come to and go on home. Now, I was in trouble, but I acted in self-defense, and I knew this girl would back up my story. So the next day I was arrested for assaulting a law enforcement officer, which the state of Mississippi frowns on, and I never saw the outside of a cell after that day for 3 years. My date that night was no help. She never showed up at my hearing. My sentence was 5 years, but I got out in 3. My lawyer said that I should be thankful, said I could have gotten up to 10 years on that charge. I shouldn't have gotten a day, but that's the way things go. I wasn't the first man alive to go down over an innocent night out with a pretty girl with a jealous boyfriend. But now I was out and only been home for a week, and I didn't want to deal with the law this soon after being released. So I looked down at the woman, and her eyes were closed, but she wasn't sleeping. I knelt beside her. "Ma'am, can you talk to me? Can you tell me where you live?" Her eyes opened, and I could see she was trying to talk. I brought her a glass of water, and she perked up, even tried to sit up, and I helped her, and she drank the water in small swallows. She mumbled a few words I couldn't understand. "Ma'am, where do you live?" I asked. Her eyes rose to meet mine, and she said, "I don't know where I live." "Fantastic. I have a half-naked elderly woman in my house, and she doesn't even know where she lives. I was going to have to call the law. I had heard stories about old people walking off and being gone for days, and that dementia took a toll on them and their families. Well, I knew a girl who worked at the nursing home, but the problem was that I didn't know her number. So I started calling the few numbers I had assembled in my new phone, trying to find a way to get in touch with her. Well, the second number I called was Mandy Spade. Now, Mandy and I had been friends since we were kids. I told her the situation and described the woman, and Mandy thought she knew who she was, and my day brightened a little bit. "Let me make a phone call, and I'm going to call you right back," she told me. I sat next to the woman. Her knees and shins were covered in dry blood and dirt, and her feet were in terrible shape. Where had she come from, and how long had she been out wandering the fields? I gathered towels and a pail of water, and I started cleaning her up and doing what I could for her feet. I didn't know how she was going to walk out of my house, 'cause she wasn't walking on those feet. She winced a few times as I cleaned her up where I could see, but she never acted like it was unbearable. And I wiped the dust from her face and arms, and the cool rags seemed to calm her. The phone rang. "Jet, I think that's Norma Wilson. Now, I just talked to her daughter. Her name is Samantha Jones, and her and I work together at the hospital. She said her mother's been missing since last night when she got off work. They've been driving around the roads looking for her. She said the police wouldn't help until she'd been missing 24 hours. Now, can you believe that?" "Yeah, I believe it. What does she want to do? This woman can't walk." "Oh, she already called an ambulance, and they're on their way now. Should be there soon." "Oh, I should have called an ambulance. I don't know why I didn't think about that." "I wouldn't worry about it. Miss Wilson has dementia, and I doubt she'll even know her daughter. I guess they're going to have to put her in a nursing home. That's what she told me." "Yeah, that's probably a good idea. Listen, Mandy, thanks for your help. I'm glad I called you." "Lord, I am too," Mandy said. The medics cleaned her feet a little more while she sat on my couch, and they wrapped her feet. The frail little woman was placed on the stretcher, and they took her out. When I saw Samantha, we remembered each other from school, and she thanked me over and over for bringing her mother inside and looking after her. Miss Wilson had been gone since last night. That meant she had been out all night and had walked 6 or 8 miles from their house. It's hard to imagine that, but it happened. And when I saw her was when she had given up. She wasn't able to take another step. And if I hadn't thought about going back to that field, I would have never seen her, and she would have died. So I felt pretty good about everything. That was until the patrol car pulled into my yard. 2 uniforms got out and walked toward me as the ambulance pulled away. That scar I gave him was still as red as a bead across his cheekbone, and I grinned looking at it when he got closer. His partner told him to back off and to stand in the yard while he talked to me, but I never took my eyes off of him. "Now, what's the story, Jet?" "Ain't no story." "How did that woman end up at your house?" "What makes you think she was in my house?" "We hear all the chatter on these radios. Now drop the bullshit and tell me what happened. I don't have anything to say to you." I never looked at him. I kept my eyes on that fat asshole in the yard, and I admired that thick red scar on his face. You have to admit it's strange. An 80-year-old woman walks through all these fields and woods and ditches all night and winds up on your couch. Something stinks about this whole thing, he said. Now, how did she get in your house? He looked down at his partner and got a grin out of him. That's when I knew what was happening. Hey, Leonard, you ever try rubbing Vaseline on that scar? Maybe it wouldn't be such a prominent feature on your ugly face. I knew that wouldn't go over well, but I had to say it. They were working some kind of angle to provoke me into saying anything they could use against me and charge me with something. I knew it. I needed to change the subject and the mood. Hey, James, did Leonard ever tell you the story about how I beat the shit out of him with his own nightstick down at Luray watershed a few years ago? Did he ever tell you why that happened? The silence is what I wanted. James had shut up, and Leonard was shifting his weight from one foot to the other. I broke the lull in the conversation. Leonard's cat got your tongue? I guess you and me and that girl are the only ones who know what happened that night. Unless you want to tell me and James now. Now, why you got to be that way, Jet? Said Deputy James. I have some questions and I need answers. Stop stirring the shit. You shouldn't have brought him here, and you know it, James. I'm going inside unless you have something to say. I'm just doing my job, Jet. We might need a statement from you on this thing with Miss Wilson. I walked in the door and shut it behind me, and by the time I got to the kitchen, I heard their patrol car pull away. I cleaned up the bloody rags and towels, and I ran them in the washer. Then I fixed a sandwich, and I went to the back porch, and I sat thinking about what in the world they had up their sleeve. Nothing came of that incident for some time, and I didn't see the law, not once. Samantha Jones stopped by a week later, and she brought me a pie. I thought that was nice. She said Miss Wilson was recovering in the hospital, and they would be moving her to a nursing home as soon as the doctors released her. Samantha, do you know where your mother was heading? I asked before she could leave. I know where she was trying to get to. You know, she has dementia. She doesn't remember anything much about the last few decades of her life, but she remembers a lot from when she was young. Jet, it's almost like she's 20 again. It took us a long time to figure out what she was talking about the last year or two, but she has friends who recognize some of the names and the events that she does remember. We put it all together, and now we understand. The doctors say this is normal, and they don't know why they hang on to those old memories so tight and let go of what's happening in the best years of their life, raising a family and children and grandchildren. I would think that the memories of more recent times would be the easiest to recall, but that's not the way this is going. I think she recognizes my brother and me about once a week now. She sees us and she calls us by other names. And in a way, it's hurtful to us, but in another way, sometimes she seems so happy being a teenager again, and I guess I can understand that. Oh, I'm sorry y'all are having to deal with all that, I said. You said you know where she was headed. Can you tell me? Maybe another time. Billy and the kids are waiting on me, and I need to get back to the house. But thank you so much for finding her. Because of you, we get to keep her for a little while longer. Oh, I'm glad to help, I said, and thanks for the pie. Like most people in this town, I knew Leonard from grade school. He hadn't changed since then, still the same spoiled kid. Children in school fractioned into groups. His friends were about appearances and how they dressed, and a class system that put them in a category of snobs. That's what we called them. Anything they had or did was better than what you had or did, according to them, and they wasted not 1 minute letting you know it all the time. His folks, I think, had inherited land and money. My friends and I were common people whose parents worked at the plants, the furniture factories, or small businesses in town. I'm older now, and I've seen some life, and there are two things I know to be a fact. First, what you think of your place in the community doesn't matter. It's an illusion people create in their mind, and they believe it so much, and they never change. And last, kids act just like their parents. Leonard had been an asshole all his life, but he came by it honest because he acted just like his daddy. I had humiliated him in front of the girl that he was after. actually in front of the whole town once the word got around, and he wasn't going to let it go. Every person who saw that scar on his face remembered how it got there, and I imagine he remembered every day when he combed his hair. 3 years in Parchman had not satisfied his anger and probably never would, and I'd have to be careful what I did and not let him provoke me because I was in the parole system and one infraction would send me straight back to Parchman. Leonard's father, Maynard Stilts, owned the property on the backside of my family's land. I think they owned as much as 1,000 acres, and they rented it to farm and they took timber from a few sections. It was land that had been in his family for generations. And in the winter, the family hunted it. People were always back there. And I had cut his fence to get my tractor to Miss Wilson. The fence served no purpose now, but they had once kept cows on their place and the fence remained. I wasn't ever going to talk about that or give the story to the sheriff unless I had to. And even then, I was going to lie and say I found the poor woman on my property. Over the next week, I finished cutting my field and got them looking like something, and then in October, I disked food plots in several places, one in the backfield that backed up to the Stilts place. It was the last field I turned over, and it was late on a clear evening, just about dark, and I saw Maynard Stilts and others back there cutting shooting lanes. We never spoke, and we never waved at each other. I didn't think much of him. He turned a few small things into big issues while my father was alive. He was a big, loud man who always got his way, and if he didn't, he'd make you pay one way or another. He was hollering at me from his side, waving his arms at me to stop and talk, but I never stopped. I didn't want anything to do with the whole family, so I just kept working. He eventually walked away from the fence and stopped hollering and waving at me. They were setting up a new shooting house. Another man, who I think may have been Leonard, stood and watched me, while a man on an excavator tilted the shooting house up into place. When I made my last pass, they were nailing ladder rungs on the wood stilts, and it was dark, so I went back to the house. I'd throw out seed the next day and be done with the food plots. Deer season had been open for a couple of weeks, only a few days after tilling my fields. I had my stands set up, 2 of them, both stands placed inside the trees a few yards close to game trails. I could hunt the woods behind me and the fields in front of me. By Thanksgiving, I had taken 2 doe and had meat in the freezer. The rest of the season would be waiting for a big buck. The second Saturday in December, and after a hard week at work, I got a day to get in my stand. In the dark, I walked to the backfield and climbed into my stand. By the time I got there, I was sweating, and it was 15 degrees, and it wasn't long before I was cold. I was determined to stay there until noon, and I sat there shivering, feet and hands numb, and I had to move more than I should have to get comfortable. I should walk slower and avoid sweating, I thought to myself. I made it until 10, and I decided I wasn't going to make it any longer, so I started to climb down and head to the house. I heard a woman calling. The pines were singing when the wind picked up, and I thought I was hearing something that I wasn't. I stepped down 2 more rungs, and I heard it again. It was a woman's voice, a raised voice, and I stopped. There were 2 voices, 2 women yelling, one louder than the other, and then a male voice yelling. Had to be a group hunting in the Stilt shooting house, so I paid no attention. I got to the ground and walked fast back to the house. I got warm, fixed something to eat, laid on the couch watching the game on TV, and I fell asleep. Banging on the front door woke me. My watch showed 1:15 p.m. I opened the door, and James, the deputy, jerked me out on the porch and handcuffed me. What the hell was going on was my first thought, but I didn't say it. I'd learned from my lawyer years ago to keep my mouth shut. I was in sock feet and a T-shirt, and I was shoved in the back seat, and we drove away. "You could have let me put on some shoes," I said. Leonard looked back at me from the passenger seat and he said, "So you could grab a gun and kill us?" "I'm a convicted felon. I can't own a gun, dumbass." "It's standard procedure, Jet," said James. "We'll get some shoes on you at the station." "Well, what's this about?" I asked. Leonard looked back again. "Like you don't know. Playing stupid is a good defense, isn't it?" I knew then that it was over. Whatever crime they were about to charge me with would send my life into a spiral once again. I never said another word until my lawyer showed up, and that was Monday. He sat across the table in the conference room sipping coffee and looking over some papers. "Why'd they arrest me?" I asked. "You don't know?" "Ain't nobody said a word to me," I said. "I haven't talked to the DA yet, so I don't know they'll be charging you with anything just yet. But I can tell you that a body of an elderly woman was found on your property. I spoke with the sheriff for a few minutes. They think you killed her and dumped her in the weeds of one of your fields. Says he has a witness to watch you do it. What can you tell me now?" "I can't tell you anything because I don't even know what you're talking about. Whose body?" "Well, let me look here. Let's see." He shuffled through the notes. "It's a white female, approximately 80 years old. She was identified by her daughter as Miss Norma Wilson, a resident of Magnolia Nursing Home here in town." "Miss Wilson?" I asked. "You know her?" he said. "Well, I can't say that I know her. She showed up on my place a few weeks ago. She's overheated and pretty beat up from walking around in the woods. She's got dementia, and she had wandered away from the house, and I helped her to the house, and her daughter came and got her, or the ambulance came to get her. I heard she was in that nursing home now." "Jet, have you seen her since then?" "No," I said. "If they charge you with her death, I'll try to find out what evidence they have that makes them think it's you. I'll be back with you after I talk to the DA. I can't do anything until they formally charge you. And if they don't charge you today, you'll be out of here by tonight." "Okay, I'll wait to hear from you. Can you get a pair of shoes to me? Maybe a sweatshirt? It's cold in here." "Let me see what I can do. Don't talk to anyone. You know the drill, right?" I sat in that county cell for 2 months waiting for my trial. Once a week, I met with my lawyer. The meetings were short because he never had anything new to tell me. The only evidence the state had was a witness who claimed he saw me place the body in the weeds. My lawyer was a good man, and he believed I had nothing to do with the woman's death. The story that day and my movements up until I was arrested was told exactly the same every time he asked me to tell it. That day back in September when I found her was always the same too, even though I kept my lie about where I found her. At that point, it didn't matter where I found the woman, but I had told her daughter that her mother had collapsed on my property and not the Stilts place, and if I ever changed that small detail, they would peg me as changing my story. I knew no one had seen me carry her back to my house that day, so I stuck with the story. A dark sense of the world consumed me in that cell. It was a cold, lifeless place, constantly lit by fluorescent lights that hummed and clicked 24 hours a day. Sometimes there were others in other cells. Some of them never said a word to me, and that was fine, and some could not shut their mouths, and I was glad to see them released and gone. My brother and my sister were allowed to visit, and I saw them 2 or 3 times. My sister left some books for me to pass the time, but I couldn't read them, couldn't get the ordeal off my mind. The death penalty was talked about, and we didn't know how the DA would proceed for a while. The whole case hung on one witness, and if they had physical evidence, we didn't know about it. And my lawyer said they had examined Miss Wilson's body and even done an autopsy, which included a sexual assault kit, and they found nothing to put me in contact with her. And he went on to say that if they had a good case, they would have gone for the death sentence, and that was the only hope I had. She had most likely died from a blow to her head, according to the coroner's report. Someone had hit her with something. My house and every field and patches of woods had been searched looking for this weapon, but nobody had found anything, and that surprised me. The witness was Maynard Stilts, and if he wanted to set me up, he sure missed his chance to lock everything down by planting something around my place. He had not seen me kill the woman, that was his testimony, and it would be that he watched me from his shooting house carry Miss Wilson over my shoulder, walk up to a wire fence and cut all 4 strands, and then place her body on his land and walk away toward my house. Now, I knew I had cut those strands of wire months earlier to get my tractor to Miss Wilson. The cuts would still look fresh, and it did back up his story. I had done that, but not the day Miss Wilson was found. He found that wire cut and he knew he could use that to add weight to his story. I couldn't believe that I could be put away for life because one man said he saw me do something that I had not done. But this is small town Mississippi, and these small towns are virtually isolated from the world. They have their own personalities. Most are ruled by one or more families, and the Stilts family was one of them, and they were going to get their revenge for what I did to Leonard years ago. You can't stop these things once they get started, not in a little town like this. On the days that I didn't obsess on what was happening to me, I would think about Mrs. Wilson and the short time I spent with her. I never got to know anything about her. We didn't exchange a coherent sentence between us, but her voice locked in my memory and how she spoke and the soft tone of it all. And I wondered if there were other men, even boys, who were drawn to that gentle sound of a woman's voice like hers. It starts with a voice, and it showers a man with the warm affection and concern as if she gives a damn about him. The memory of her slender fingers tracing the wounds on her face and legs and never complaining, even looking at me with a hint of a smile, as if she didn't want me to bother with her and that she couldn't figure out where the scratches had come from. And in a way, I fell in love with her spirit that day, and I thought about her through the weeks before she died. I wanted to call her daughter and ask about her, but not wanting to put myself in the business of people that I didn't know. I wish my mother had had that demeanor, and I didn't feel bad about that. I sat in that cell, and I hoarded my thoughts and worries and the dread of going back to Parchment again, this time for good. The days began to blur as one, and by that time I was beginning to accept my future of nothing while pushing the thoughts of hope away. Might as well get mentally prepared for a guilty verdict so I wouldn't want to kill myself when the decision was made. I wasn't going to be surprised if things went bad, and I would be shocked and happy if I was found not guilty. And then things changed 1 week before the trial. It was during the day when someone came into the holding area of the jail. I had memorized every noise in that place, and I knew someone was heading to my cell. I stood from my bunk, half asleep, and looked out the small inch-thick glass in the wall, and I saw the green leaves of May blowing in the breeze, and then looked back to find my lawyer standing in front of the bars. He was alone, which was odd because no one was allowed back there without a cop. "I may have good news for you, Jet. Actually, I think it is good news. I think you're going to be let out of here by tomorrow. New evidence has come to light," he said. "Investigators are confirming what they have, but I've seen it, and it's a matter of a few hours and you'll be released." "What happened?" I asked. "Let's get it confirmed first, and then I'll fill you in. I just couldn't wait to let you know. Things are looking good. Now hang tight, and I'll be back with you when we're sure." "This better be the real deal," I said. "I wouldn't have told you unless I was sure," he said. I spent the next hours watching the green leaves blow on a blustery day out the small opening in the wall. The minutes ticked by and it got dark outside. So with new energy, I started doing push-ups and sit-ups to try to drain my anxiety. I was exhausted when 2 men came to the cell. They opened the gate and released me that night, and I was given a ride to my house. Several calls to my lawyer went unanswered. I was afraid to get comfortable with this new freedom, and I expected it all to change within minutes, but the night went on, and I fell asleep on the couch. When I woke, I got a shower and changed into my regular clothes, and I started breakfast. There was a knock on the door, and it pulled my attention away, and I invited Samantha Jones inside. She looked happy, and she walked ahead of me into the kitchen and sat down at the table. I stood there staring at her, not knowing why she was there. "You got enough food for 2?" she asked. "I can make so there's enough. Are you hungry?" We ate eggs and bacons and biscuits, and she told me a story. "My family is not from here. My grandparents came here looking for work a lot of years ago, and they stayed. They never had much, but Granddaddy made a life for us here. My mother was 10 when they moved here. She was 17 and in high school when she met a boy at a dance one night. He was in his 3rd year at Ole Miss. Fancy fraternity boy, dressed nice and drove a nice car and had money in his pocket. Had a powerful family here, and she knew all that. He danced with my mother all night, never asked another girl to dance. He must have told her that he loved her at some point, made promises, you know how that goes. After the dance, she left with him, and when he was done with her, he dropped her off on a county road somewhere and he drove off in the dark. It must have been a pathetic sight. Every time I think about that night for my mother, I feel like crying. Well, it wasn't too many weeks after that night she tried to see him again to tell him that she was pregnant, but he wouldn't see her. His father ran her off the property and told her to never come back with those lies, and if she did, he would have her arrested. And that scared her to death, and she stayed away. Now, my family are good people. They supported my mother, and she had the baby, and the baby was me. Yes, I am Maynard Stiltz's daughter, and I can prove it now with new technology, but there's no need for that. Look at me, Jet, and think about him, and you can see we share a few features. I looked into her eyes and tried to visualize Stiltz. I'd not spend 10 minutes with Maynard Stiltz in my whole life, but when she said that, I could see it, and I nodded my head. The other reason I haven't pursued this is because I know that he knows who I am. For years, whenever I ran into him in town somewhere, he would lock eyes with me, and I never knew why. Sometimes it would make me uneasy, but I could count on his stare each time we were within shouting distance. But now I know why. Now, I told you back in September that my mother seemed to only remember things from 60 years in the past and hardly anything after that. Well, one night, not too long ago, before she died, she had a lucid half hour in the nursing home, and she told me this whole story. And it was a shock to me because all I ever knew was my daddy, and I thought I belonged to him. Lord, I'm glad he's gone on account of this because he was such a good man, and all this with Mama would have been a huge burden on him now. Anyway, I had so many questions for Mama when she told me this, but it wasn't long before she slipped away to wherever dementia takes people, and she didn't even know I was sitting there anymore. Now, can you imagine a woman carrying this secret all those years? Imagine the shame she must have felt being a single mother way back then. I'm just thankful my family are such good people, and they loved her and me and us just like none of that had ever happened. Now, you ask where my mother was headed back in September. She was trying to get to Maynard Stiltz. I don't know why or what she wanted with him, and we will never know. I suspect had she been in the right state of mind, she wouldn't have thought twice about that mean old man and his family. Samantha stopped talking. She dabbed the tears from her eyes. It was a good time to ask a question. Is that why she was on my place in December? How did she get away from the nursing home, or did someone give her a ride out here? Samantha composed herself. We don't know how she got over this way, but it looks like she walked. You know the home she was in is only a couple of miles down the highway. She had the sense to put on a coat and shoes. We think she just started walking, like she had done the first time you saw her. There was a pause, like Samantha was gathering her thoughts on what or how to say the next thing. Jet, your lawyer called me. He asked me to tell you that he should have been the one to tell you why the case against you went away. But after he heard this story, he thought it would be better coming from me. I'm the one who turned in the evidence that cleared you. I gave it to him because he would know the channels and the way to take care of all this. Now, that was 2 days ago. Last night they set you free. But before I tell you the rest of it, I want you to know that I never once thought you did anything to my mother, not once. I knew that if she had been murdered, that it was not you. Well, thanks for that, I said. I worried about what y'all thought of me while I was in jail. Well, I know you deer hunters set up cameras all over the woods, and her murder was on video. It even had audios captured on one of those cameras. Now, I couldn't watch it, but my husband did, and we rushed it over to your lawyer's office immediately. She was filmed on 2 cameras that are strapped to trees. One shows her walking past the lens, and that's it. The other shows her coming into the frame and being confronted by a woman, Mrs. Stilts. Now, this woman's all bundled up, but it's plain it's her. She seemed to have compassion for my mother. She even took off her coat to wrap around Mama's shoulders. But it isn't long before old man Stilts comes into the frame and Mama starts talking about that night when they were young. You can hear him tell her that she's crazy and to shut up over and over, but she tells him what she wanted to say anyway. And Miss Stilts stands there with her mouth open. This is all a big surprise to her. The whole conversation is broken because that video evidently shuts off and on again when movement triggers it. But my husband says she really gave it to that old man, gave her a piece of her mind, and that her daughter needed to be taken care of. Stilts' wife runs out of the frame, and we think she went to get a vehicle to get Mama to someplace warm, because it was freezing out there that day. And when she's gone, my husband says you can see Mama point her finger at Maynard's face, and she says something that he couldn't understand. Once Mrs. Stilts is gone for a minute, Maynard Stilts turns his rifle around. He grabs it by the barrel, and he hits Mama on the head, and she falls to the ground. Jet, Maynard Stilts killed my mother. All the mean things he's done to her through the years by ignoring us, and he winds up killing her. I just can't get my mind around it. The last video is him dragging her toward your place. That's where he left her, then called the police, and then blamed it on you. They arrested him and his wife yesterday, and they're sitting in the jailhouse where you were. I bet they get released on bond before the day is over. They have the money, and you know the judge will be favorable to them because of who they are. I imagine his wife will be released without charges. I don't think she knew what he had done, but that story will all come out soon. It was the oddest story I'd ever heard, and the hell of it was that I had somehow been mixed up in it all. I didn't know what to say, so I just sat there looking at Samantha. Jet, the last thing I have to tell you is who gave us the video cards, but you have to keep his name to yourself. I nodded that I would. Leonard Stilts, Maynard's son, Leonard Stilts, my brother, turned in the evidence that will convict his own father. He wanted me to tell you that enough is enough. Now, he believed for months that you would kill Mama, but one day he remembered those cameras, and he took the cards out of them. Said he went a few days before looking at them, that they rode around in his coat pocket for 4 or 5 days. But when he looked at the videos and saw what had happened, he knew he had to do the right thing. I think he understands that you may never want to talk to him, but he wanted you to know. I heard you went to prison over something between you and him. Maybe he feels bad about that, I don't know. Well, now you know the truth, and you can get on with your life, Jet. Samantha stood and hugged my neck. I can't say I didn't appreciate her affection. Maybe it was in her eyes, maybe the curve of her jaw that favored Maynard Stilts, but she was still Norma Wilson's daughter all the way through. I felt that from her touch. She drove away, and I haven't talked to her since. Maynard Stilts was released on bond the next day. The day after that, he hung himself in his basement. There was a big scandal in town, and the talk went on for weeks. His wife was not charged. She sold their place and moved to another state, and I have new neighbors that I have not met. I see Leonard from time to time. We never talk, but each time I see him, I nod or touch the brim of my hat, and he understands what I'm saying. I appreciate you listening to this podcast. If you thought it was worthy and you enjoyed it, maybe you can hit the thumbs up button or hit the subscribe button. We'd love to have you along and come back. Mainly, just the next time one of my videos shows up in your feed, click on it because it's always a good story. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you on the next one, and that next one will be early this week.
Mountain so very high, I gotta lay down here and rest, where I can take another step down.